Hi everyone. So we're actually delving into what this whole class is about today. We're starting with our cultural lenses. Cultural lenses are kind of what we're going to view our narratives through. So in this class, you're going to choose to create an argument based on a TV show, movie, or a video game, and you're going to be applying a cultural lens to that. And we'll be going over what a cultural lens is, how to apply it to narratives, those kinds of things, as well as talking about kind of an introduction to a cultural lens with New Historicism. Don't worry about New Historicism for a second. We'll get into that in a minute. So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about what is kind of literary criticism or a cultural lens. This is what English majors do. How do we read narratives? Basically, we can translate the kind of skills that we use when we're analyzing books and stories in books to the things we watch on TV or play in video games. Obviously, only ones that contain stories and narratives like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But still, we can read those narratives through these certain lenses. With New Historicism, we're going to be talking about how do history and narratives influence one another, and then how does history and narrative in media influence one another, and then how do we write on this? How do we actually apply this to an essay if we were going to write on New Historicism as our cultural lens of choice in this class? So first off, what is a cultural lens? So essentially in literature classes, you might be asked to interpret a narrative based on certain theories. So in this case, we're referring to them as lenses. So when you're reading a story or you're viewing a story on TV or a movie or something like that, you can look through the narrative, through the story, through certain lenses, through certain angles, through certain light. So think about it in this way. So you know those sunglasses that have red lenses, right? Or any colored lens. You put those glasses on and you kind of see the world through a red viewpoint. You see the world through those red lenses, and you're viewing the world through that lens. That's essentially what we're doing with each of these cultural lenses. So we're seeing narratives through them. So the narrative becomes not only just the story on the screen, but it's actually taking into account these outside contexts and applying it to the narrative and how this actually matters. This is basically what English majors do in order to critically analyze story closely, and you can do the exact same thing that you do in an English class with books as you can apply to media. Stories are incredibly nuanced. So the word nuanced means that it has many layers. It's more than just what's on the page. It's more than just what you're watching. There are many outside contexts that inform that story, that inform that plot, inform those characters that we're going to be talking about. So basically, the big assignment for this class is for your final paper, you're going to be applying one of these cultural lenses to an applicable narrative from a TV show, video game, or a movie of your choice. So you can do it one of two ways. You can choose a cultural lens and then find a narrative that it fits, or you can, if you already have a favorite TV show or a favorite movie or something like that, then whatever cultural lens makes the most sense to you or that you find is applicable, or that you just think is the most interesting and actually works with it. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So you'll be choosing a cultural lens and then applying that to the story or the narrative in media of your choice. And we'll talk more about that assignment when we get to it. So New Historicism is the first cultural lens that we're looking at. And New Historicism, I know that's a big phrase, a big word, but rest assured, it just means history, basically. This is the history theory, if you want to think about it that way. You don't have to say New Historicism, you can just call it the history theory. On the right here, we have Stephen Greenblatt. He's a professor who is part of literary studies, and he founded New Historicism and kind of talks about history and narrative going hand in hand with one another. So basically what New Historicism says is that history and culture fit hand in hand with narrative. They cannot be separated. So basically, when you're watching something on screen, you have to take into account what time period was this movie produced under. Does that matter to what the narrative is? Does that matter to how the characters act? Those kinds of things. As well as this, New Historicism looks at history as being fluid and constantly changing. Now, that's not to say that history, there's no facts in history. Of course there are facts, right? When we have evidence for things, then those things become fact because we have firsthand accounts or, archaeology, those kinds of things, they become fact. But as we discover more about the past, uncover documents or those firsthand accounts and those kinds of things, our view of history might change. Our view of history has changed in the last 40 years as we uncover new things about it. Therefore, it's not stable or constant because it's told through multiple perspectives by people. So imagine if we only had one person's story from the 40s, for example, or one person's story from the COVID-19 pandemic. That wouldn't take into account the entire history of it as a whole. You need multiple perspectives to truly understand these kinds of events, and from different people who have different identities and different viewpoints of viewing the world. Um, Basically, history is vital to understanding story, is what New Historicism looks at. So that's kind of what I mean by New Historicism, and what do we mean by the multiple perspectives that we talked about in the last slide? Kind of asking, why does it matter who tells the history? Does it matter if one person who wasn't affected at all by the COVID-19 pandemic tells the story, whereas someone who lost family members or those kinds of things tells the story about the COVID-19 pandemic? That would definitely make a difference in the perspective of how we view that history, right? Whose perspective are we listening to? And how does that inform the narrative? Are we only listening to the perspective of the people who won the battle? We don't hear the perspective about the other side, right? We need to take all these perspectives into account to fully understand the historical context of things. But of course, like I said, we do need evidence to make facts credible. We can't just be claiming things, right? We actually need evidence to back it up. And of course, that's a big part of this class. That's a big part of this class also, is research and finding evidence. So obviously this is an online class, so we can't discuss things, but I want you all to consider this question on your own. Some people claim Christopher Columbus was the discoverer of America, or the continental United States, and the New World. How might this perspective inform how we view history? And then what do we lose by leaving out other perspectives other than just this one man's perspective? So basically, the main idea of New Historicism is that literary texts influence the socio-historical world that influence the literary texts, so that the textuality of history and the historicity of texts shape and reshape each other in a continuous cycle of mutual influence. Those are a lot of words. That's a lot of jargon, right? But basically, what this boils down to is that history informs the stories that we watch on screen, and the stories that we watch on screen inform how we view each other and how we view society, how we interact with one another. They're kind of mutual friends in that way, and they kind of play off of one another, constantly changing each other. So let's look at some examples of where we see this. So obviously, if you know me, if you've had Comp 1 with me, you know I'm, of course, going to use a Batman example. Our first example here is the movie Batman Begins, which is the first movie in the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy. And it was made in 2005. And if you think back to what you remember from history class, of what politically was happening in the world in 2005, this film was released just 4 years after the events of September 11th, 2001, so 9/11. So how might Batman Begins reflect a post 9/11 American culture? And of course, you don't have to have seen the movie to think about this. So if you're not seeing Batman Begins, it's pretty gritty. It's dark. The actual visuals of it is dark. It's pretty gruesome. It's violent. Those kinds of things. But it also has a really great societal critique, talking about corruption in cities and corruption in society's infrastructure. So places like the judicial system, police departments, transportation, all of these kinds of things that are corrupt. And people's distrust of these kinds of organizations, people's distrust of the government, and those kinds of things happen in this movie, as well as society's need for a certain kind of hero. So Batman is kind of more of a darker hero than what we've seen from the past. So how might, if we know these things to be true in the plot, in the narrative, how might Batman Begins reflect a post 9/11 American culture? So that's one thing to consider here. And that's also one way to apply New Historicism, is looking at how the events of the time under which a film was released actually affect the story itself. So in terms of it affecting story itself, a good example of this is actually Star Wars. So Star Wars A New Hope, which is the very first one in the series, came out in 1977. So if you think back to the political climate of 1977, how might social, cultural, and political climate of a time of a piece of media's release affect the narrative? So A New Hope developed in a period marked by the very end of the Vietnam War. And this is actually where New Historicism becomes really interesting, because George Lucas, who is the director of Star Wars, actually took inspiration from these sentiments expressed by the Vietnam War, all the anti-war sentiments and the need for peace and a hero and these kinds of things, marked by the end of the Vietnam War, and actually applied this when he wrote Star Wars. So this is actually a true thing that we're not just theorizing here, but this is actually a true fact that George Lucas did take into historical account what was going on in the world politically and culturally around him when he was writing this. So we can look at things like examples of the rebels versus empire. So you've got an oppressive regime taking over the world, basically, and all these rebels rising up to fight it. There's also a very anti-establishment theme within Star Wars, where they also distrust the government, and that was definitely seen marked by the end of the Vietnam War, as well as a critique of the military and military power and the military-industrial complex in America. So all of these things wrapped up uh, uh, inform how the social, cultural, and political climate of a time do actually affect a piece of media's narrative itself. So not just the way it looks on screen like Batman Begins, but actually the plot of the movie itself and the actual point of the movie itself. So far, we've kind of only been talking about historical events of the past. So with the Vietnam War and 9/11 and those kinds of things, but we have to consider also that we are living under history right now. That if you've watched the news at any point in the last few months, we are definitely living under a politically hot time. And of course, if we're looking at new historicism as meaning that the media that's produced under that time reflects the climate that it's under, then of course the things that we're producing right now, current TV shows, movies, video games, those kinds of things, probably also reflect the climate that we're living in right now. Because remember that we're living through history right now. We're always living through history, but in 30 years, we might be able to look back at things like Squid Game I've got on the screen right now and analyze how it reflects a post-pandemic society and those kinds of things. So how do modern shows like Squid Game inform current society? So what might the kinds of shows we enjoy tell us about our society post-pandemic? So if you've not seen Squid Game, it's kind of a thriller, I would say horror, show where contestants compete for a huge sum of money. Many of them are not well off, so they really need that sum of money. But unfortunately, only one survives to win the money. The rest of the contestants die if they don't pass the trials, basically. So it's that kind of game show, kind of a Hunger Games-esque vibe. Um, but this definitely, in my opinion, if this was released in 2021 and is still going on, I think this definitely reflects people's sentiments in America post-pandemic. You have the idea and the themes of the illusion of control, the desire for escape and promise of a better life, and then also the psychological toll under desperation and stress that we see in Squid Game definitely also reflects our modern society and how we feel in the current climate. So basically, what we're doing with these cultural lenses is we're forming an argument using them. So you're going to use the cultural lens of your choice to prove your argument. So the Parker readings, which are the PDFs that I upload, are where you're going to pull the actual quotes and citations from in order to back up your claims. So here's just an example, and we'll get to this much later in the class, but here's just an example to get you thinking about the kinds of things that you might be interested in writing about. So here's an example that could be an excerpt from your final paper if you chose to use New Historicism as your cultural lens. In Batman Begins, the crumbling infrastructure of Gotham City represents a disjointed and decentered America post 9/11, according to Parker, and then you find a citation that backs that up, basically. So if you have any questions about new historicism or cultural lenses in general, please feel free to email me. It's much harder to teach this online than it is in person, and I can answer questions as they come on the slides, but please feel free to reach out to me. We can have an email thread going, or we can set up a time to Zoom, anything like that if you have any questions.